so much for coming on and agreeing to do an episode.
No trouble at all.
But I'll get you to give a bit of background on what you do and why you're an expert. And then we can get stuck into what businesses need to consider before expanding into the US or any other market. Tracy is an A2X expert partner. So you've been with A2X, using A2X for how long? You found it quite early.
Yeah, so probably been using A2X for the last, say, 4 to 5 years. But since you guys brought out the Shopify solution, much more of an intense relationship, since most of our clients here in Australia tend to be Shopify users more so than Amazon users, at least at the moment.
Yeah, cool. And so how did you kind of get into the e-commerce niche?
Great question. So around the same time, 4 to 5 years ago, there was a real movement amongst accountants where we were being encouraged to consider niching or specializing as a way of really cutting through a lot of the complexity that our world throws our way around different general ledger platforms and add-on solutions that work with Xero. And I was really considering that piece, and it just seemed to me time and time again that the most enjoyment I took was from working with clients in the e-commerce space. And digging into that a little deeper, I concluded that it was mostly about the fact that I'm a really big technology user, and I love data, and I love how data interfaces between systems. And owners of e-commerce, I'm generalizing of course, but often tend to be a little bit younger, a little bit more pro technology, and they're happy to dispense with the niceties of conversation and really just go straight into the nitty gritty of how things are going to work. And that just really resonated with me. So I kind of found my tribe with the e-commerce owners and business people.
Cool. And so how long have you been an accountant for?
Oh, over 20 years. So I'm in my mid to late 40s now. So I qualified in my 20s. Yeah. So a long time. Originally a Canadian chartered accountant and did my exams there. Moved to Australia a bit over 20 years ago and became an Australian chartered accountant at that time.
Oh, wow. Cool. So the e-commerce space is lucky to have you, someone that actually embraces technology, wants to find best practice. And so, so thank you again for coming on. And today we are going to talk about expanding and when is the right time to consider expanding internationally as an e-commerce business? I'm sure you've dealt with many different situations, but what would you kind of say is like the right time? When do you find most clients start to kind of consider expanding overseas?
So by way of background, I guess just to paint the picture, we only at Bean Ninjas work with 7-figure e-com businesses, or at least that's our preference for onboarding new e-com clients now. So I wanted to just put that out there. If you're a brand new e-com, I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting information to take, but please do consider that most of our clients have been operating probably for at least 12 months, although as you probably know in e-com, you can go to 0 and to 7 figures in a month if you've got the right idea and the right product. In terms of when we see our clients considering international expansion, it tends to be maybe one of 3 reasons. The first is they've really run out of ideas about how to promote their product within. I'll pick on Australia because that's where I'm speaking to you, but obviously this could be any country that you're operating in. So they've really moved through all of the obvious ways to find an audience, to sell their product. And often it can be linear around pay-per-click as well. So a lot of our clients find there's an immediate payback in pay-per-click. So you spend $1 and you will generate, say, $3 in sales. And they develop these analytics over a number of months or years analyzing the space. But obviously, like anything, there's going to be a saturation point there where that payback doesn't then become linear. It starts to, ebb and flow. And so they've reached a conclusion that maybe the market is saturated for terms of selling it in their own country. Other reasons we see our clients look to other countries is they're looking to establish a brand name, or they've got a product that's so unique and so niched, if they don't move into other markets, others will copy their product. So they really want to get out there first and have that immediate impact. And even though they haven't really exploited their own market first, they want to take more of a scattered approach. And and go into other countries. And then I think probably the third reason we see, and this is obviously specific to your own e-com business, is what sort of product are you selling and does it lend itself easily to scalability? And what I mean by that is if you're drop shipping from China and you've got a 3PL in England, that's a really great setup for expanding internationally because you're really just connecting point A with point B. But if you're an Etsy provider and you're preparing an etched signature on a pen, that's probably not a product that's going to lend itself really well to overseas expansion or not at the scale you might hope to
Yeah.
achieve.
Do you find yourself advising clients when to expand, or do you find they're kind of leading the way there and then you're kind of just enabling them to do so and to help them as they go along?
Originally, it was very much the client saying, we're about to expand to the USA. Can you help us? Can you make some introductions? These days, particularly through COVID and lockdown, we're finding more opportunity for reflection and advisory services. And often I will say, look, I've learned a few lessons from other clients. Would you like me to take you through some of those examples about how they're managing to expand their businesses? So it's a two-way street.
Yeah. Interesting. Hey, well, let's get into the nitty gritty and, pick your brains and your expertise in this area and kind of speak about what are some things that businesses do need to consider, especially around like structure implications. Should they trade through their Australian, New Zealand, or wherever they are, that entity, or do they set up new entity companies in other countries?
Right. So I guess now's the time for the disclaimer. So I know
Yeah.
the most of our conversation will be around the accounting implications of trading in other countries. And I just wanted to be clear that I'm an Australian tax agent and I'm not authorized to offer tax advice for other countries.
Yeah.
So I'll be saying quite often, I'd really recommend that you reach out and find tax advisors in those countries. But generally speaking, I've got lots of advice in that
Yeah.
space. And Ellen, I think your first question was around structure. So
Yes.
my quick advice to you as a client thinking about going overseas is don't overstructure or don't feel that you have to structure straight away. That's probably my number one tip in that unless you know something most people don't, you really have no idea how successful your overseas venture is going to be. And it might be that you're incredibly successful, and it might be unfortunately that you're not so successful. So there's lots of costs and complexity you can avoid at the beginning by continuing the expansion through your existing entity. So here in Australia, that might be a propriety limited company, or in New Zealand, a limited entity. So, do you have to put a new structure in place? Absolutely not. So, every day of the week, you probably, even in your own personal life, can think of examples where you, as an overseas customer, transact with other corporations resident in other countries, such as Microsoft and Google and MailChimp and Klaviyo, and all of these different places are all resident often in United States or Ireland or United Kingdom. So it is entirely acceptable to generate overseas income in your existing structure and pay tax on that income back in your home country. So that's kind of my first piece of advice. But you will see examples where you may want to set up an overseas structure. The first example of that would be where you're incredibly successful. So now you've got some data and you've got a few months or years of trading, and you can see that this is a really big entity in its own right. And what I'd probably recommend there is to consider why you would want that overseas entity. So many of our clients, I shouldn't say many, but if you are considering moving overseas, and this is particularly true of United States, if you have an overseas structure or corporation of which you're an owner, it can help your residency application. So that's something that sometimes the client's coming back to us and saying, this is the reason we want it. And the other thing that you might want to consider legally, and again, not a lawyer, but I'll throw my 2 cents in here for you as well, is if you're selling a product that may have some risk associated with it. So let's say it's a cream that you're rubbing on your skin, or it's an ingestible. Potentially, there could be some lawsuits that then get generated as a result of something going wrong with your product. And if you're trading as an overseas entity and you're sued, um, generally speaking, only the entity that's trading would be put at risk or in harm's way. So there's another reason that you might want to consider an overseas entity versus trading through your local entity. And then
Right.
the last reason is that you may reach the definition set by the overseas country that requires you to pay income tax in that country. But this is where you'd really need to reach out and have a chat with a tax agent in that country to say, are there reasons that I must pay income tax in, for example, England versus Australia? Those reasons usually are residency based. So if you're not living there full time and you don't have a lot of association with the country, i.e., you're not employing people there, maybe you don't have a warehouse there, those are the sorts of things they'll look at in addition to financial considerations. How much are you selling? And whether
Right.
that might sort of tick a box to require you to have a company in that country.
To like, yeah, so for that's for income tax though, right? So not sales tax. That's a whole different ball game.
Well, yeah, if you like, I could move into the sales tax
Yeah.
next. So yeah, so when clients come to us and ask about, let's pick on United States of America, do I have to pay sales tax? Do I have to pay income tax? And the answer for those two questions is not the same, unfortunately. So I've just covered the income tax a little bit.
Yeah.
And income tax tends to be more around how much are you selling and what are your ties associated with your structure in the United States as to whether you pay income tax. But income tax, the overarching principle, I believe it's true of everywhere in the world, is who owns the structure and where do those owners live.
Yeah.
And in Canada, we used to call this the sojourner's rule. I'm not sure if there's acronyms in other countries, but it looks at where you spend more than 157 days a year. So, which is half the year.
Yeah.
So, wherever you're spending the most time in a year or over half a year is generally speaking the country in which all of your worldwide income is taxed. And so, if you're in that situation, it is unlikely you will have to pay income tax through your entity trading overseas. Sales tax, though, is a completely different situation. Uh, and sales tax can differ depending on which country you're selling to. And so I'll just cover the most common ones here that we see from Australia. So to our friends in New Zealand, and I know that's where we're chatting today, Ellen,
Yeah.
if the company is selling more than $60,000 a year to New Zealand residents in New Zealand dollars, they are required to register for your New Zealand GST. Here in Australia, that threshold is $75,000 if you're selling into Australia but resident elsewhere. In England, the threshold as of the 1st of January is zero, which might surprise you. So from the very
Uh-huh.
first dollar you're selling into England since Brexit, unfortunately, you do have to register for UK VAT. With the European Union, they've just changed all their rules on the 1st of July, so just not even just over a month ago. They're making registration voluntary, but the problem is if you don't register for VAT and you ship goods to any country in Europe that's part of the European Union and you're not registered, is that your vendor or your customer, excuse me, must pay duty to clear your package, which isn't optimal and doesn't provide a
Right.
great experience for them. And it's about 20 to 22%. And then finally, in the United States, which probably is the most popular country of where our clients are looking to move, they're the most complicated at all. They have what's called a decentralized system, and so their sales tax jurisdictions are state-based or even county-based, and there's over 80 of them in the United States. And they deal with a concept called nexus, which maybe sounds familiar to
Yeah.
some of you. And there are three categories, well, main categories of nexus, which is physical nexus. So they look at where you live, where your employees live. Financial nexus, which is how much you're selling in each jurisdiction and how many orders. There's some thresholds there. And then the final nexus is oh, what have I covered? Financial and physical. I think it might be economic. And apologies, this is where I'm not so clever,
Yeah.
and I'll defer to my U.S. counterparts. But I know, for example, if you have a warehouse in a state that's supplying your clients, then you meet the nexus definition just by the fact that you've got a warehouse. So what
What
I'd
about,
recommend, and that's sorry,
oh,
Ellen.
sorry, I was going to just say, what about FBA? Like if you're using fulfillment by Amazon and you're using their warehouse, does that count as your own warehouse? Do you
Look,
know?
I actually don't know the answer these days, but I
Yeah.
do know there's some case law out there that originally the answer was yes. But Amazon's a little different again in that Amazon collects your sales tax for you. So
Yeah.
if you're fulfilling by Amazon, Thankfully, they sew that piece up for you and they charge your clients the applicable sales tax. And I expect because they meet nexus in every state, every jurisdiction because of their warehouses, they're forced to.
Yeah.
They then take that away before they make your net payments. So it's more of an issue when you're selling directly or using marketplaces such as Shopify, for example. The onus is back on yourself to make those collections.
And do you recommend, like, I know you're all for technology, but so do you recommend any sort of apps when it comes to doing tax like that when you're expanding? Because I mean, that is just so much to know, about all the different kind of, what are the levels? When are you going to trigger Nexus? Is that,
So
yeah,
our philosophy here at Bean Ninjas is really straightforward, and I think probably other firms are following a similar methodology in that we have an office in the United States and one in United Kingdom right now. And as soon as our Australian or New Zealand-based clients indicate that they're going to be selling in those countries, we recommend a consultation with those offices. So our preference is that our locally based consultants are then preparing sales and income tax returns for our clients in those countries.
yeah,
But you asked specifically about software. Again, depends on the country. So in the United States, I believe one of the most popular products is called TaxJar. And that's an overlay, for example, on Zero or your shopping carts, which will then report back to you as to your obligations based on your registrations. And over in Europe, since this new introduction of what's called the IOSS, which stands for International One-Stop Shop. There's a product called Avalara, but there's many. I'm not really recommending
yeah,
or endorsing anything specifically.
yeah.
And again, they'll take a free consult with you and have a chat with you about your preferences, and then put in their software to partner with your shopping carts.
Yeah, cool. Hey, thank you. It's so interesting. And like, I mean, we could spend all day talking about tax, right? But these are things that you do need to consider when you do want to expand into another country. More sales, more
Yes.
tax. So much fun. Um, but like, let's also kind of dial it back and kind of talk about what are some other things that merchants need to consider when they are going to go overseas, and how do you access the cheapest merchant fees on offer for the country you're exporting to?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ellen, and it's one we see frequently. So maybe just to paint the picture for you originally, and obviously myself being based
Yeah,
in Australia, I'll sort of speak from this country. If you are Australian based and own an e-commerce company and you don't have any ties elsewhere worldwide, when you then set up, say, a Shopify file for a second country, or even if you use your existing Shopify file to service the other country, Shopify does two, and sorry, I'll focus on Shopify, but this analogy is very similar for PayPal and I believe other payment gateways as well. They do two things that are incremental costs for you. The first is they still charge you the fees on offer in Australia, for example, even though you're selling only the United Kingdom. And I haven't done the comparison with UK, but I have done with the United States. And the merchant fees on offer for residents of the United States via Shopify are much cheaper, up to 1% cheaper than they are here in Australia. The second thing that they do, again, even if you configure your Shopify file to a base currency of US dollars and you're only selling to American residents, but you're setting yourself up as an Australian located person with an Australian ABN, you get charged what's called a currency conversion fee by Shopify. They will only pay out to you in your own currency. You can't then elect to be paid in US dollars because you're collecting in US. So you collect in US, that's your preference, and you can pick any currency you like on that side, but they will only pay out to you in Australian, and they charge you upwards of 2% for the privilege. So there can be a 3% margin difference between setting yourself up as, I guess, a native American versus setting yourself up as a native Australian. Is there any way around it? Probably is the next obvious question. Unfortunately, the only way that we have understood it's possible to set yourself up with, say, a US Shopify file or a UK Shopify file is to set up a structure in that country, first of all, then
right.
apply for the applicable tax identification numbers. You also need a bank account that's a bona fide bank account in that country that's linked to a social security number for a US. I don't know what the English equivalent is. So the quick answer is it's very, very difficult unless you've got residency ties to those countries to accomplish those requirements.
Oh, wow. Yeah, gosh, there's so much to consider. And I guess that kind of goes back to that structure of, yeah, whether or not you do set up overseas or
Yeah,
continue
no, you're
trading.
right. Pros and
Yeah,
cons. So there's another pro for
yeah,
considering a structure overseas. Keep in
yeah,
mind, though, that doesn't then buy you that social security number in the United States. But I've got many clients in this space trying to think about not necessarily illegal ways to solve the problem, but creative ways, let's call them.
yeah,
And yes, you need a bank account over there, but it's not just a bank account. So, for example, you might know here in Australia and New Zealand, we have products like Air Wallets, which are like virtual banks,
yeah,
which will allow you to open a US bank account. Those bank accounts so far have not met the strict requirements by Shopify as being qualified bank accounts, although I
oh,
know Air Wallets is working on this issue as we speak. Over in the States, they've got something called Mercury Bank, which is a very popular solution, very similar to Air Wallets here. Um, so it's a many layered piece. You need like the EIN in America, you need the social security number, you need the permanent address, you need a phone number, and I believe even a fax number. So there's lots of pieces you have to sort.
yeah, I can imagine. Do you know, I remember once when I moved to the UK, and I do actually have a British passport as well. And I remember like, yeah, first of all, you have to book a meeting to get the meeting, and then you have to like, you need like an address, but then you need a bank, but then you're like, which comes first? It's like chicken or the egg, and you're trying to get it all sorted to like, to get what you need to kind of go and see a doctor or something. Anyway, I'm going off
It's
on a
so
tangent, but
true. But
yeah,
if you think if the difference is 3%, and I believe for
yes,
many of our clients it is, and you're selling $1 million, which is a big number, but in e-com, it's a number that you see frequently. $30,000 US is probably a pretty big reason to think seriously about solving that problem. And
yeah,
depending on the product you're selling, it can mean the difference between profitability and losing money because margins can be so skinny in high volume environments. So 3% is a significant issue to resolve.
yeah, yeah, no, totally. When you kind of, again, this is kind of, I know we're talking kind of Shopify, and again, kind of different structures. What would your recommendation be when it comes to like, okay, do I have one Shopify store or do I set up multiple Shopify stores? How do you like, what do you see most with your clients?
We see a mixture of both, but I guess if I had to pick the more popular option, it tends to be many to many. So many Shopify files to many websites. And the reason we're seeing that, I think, I'm no expert on this
Yeah,
side, but we're in this unique position, I guess, of sitting sort of watching many different operations is Shopify, as you may know, has a bunch of subscription levels. So there's basic, there's the main Shopify, there's advanced, and then there's a product called Shopify Plus. And they all, I think the basic maybe is $29 a month, and Shopify Plus can be upwards of $2,000 a month. So a
yeah,
huge difference between those subscription levels. And if you're only using one Shopify file, you can't then offer different pricing structures to different customers. So if you're selling, say, a tube of lipstick and you know your Australian market will pay $40 for that tube, but in the United States, maybe you can only achieve $30 for it. It isn't possible with those lower down Shopify plans to be intelligent enough to recognize who's coming in via an IP address and then change the prices based on the market. So the only way they can solve that problem is to have separate Shopify files with different pricing matrices. You often see this problem as well with B2B or wholesale. So you can't have a separate pricing myriad for your wholesale versus your B2C, which is your online customers. And you can put apps into Shopify to deal with these issues, but the native Shopify doesn't solve that problem. In addition, currency. So depending on the Shopify plan that you've nominated, Shopify can be clever enough, for example, to consider where you're coming in from in terms of which website you've landed on, and then present the product to you in the currency that's related to your IP address. But it rounds for you and it makes decisions like you can put in a set FX rate, or you can put in like a link to another live foreign currency data matrix. But again, our clients often like to control those experiences. So what you often see is a landing page for Australia hooked to an Australian Shopify, a landing page for UK hooked to a UK Shopify. I guess the biggest disadvantage is then you've got, say, a number of environments to host, and then you've got many layered costs, all of those various Shopify subscriptions as well. So I've written an article about that you can find through our Bean Ninjas, and I can send Ellen you some links, but it's not obvious which way to head, but it can be really painful to change it later. So it's an important consideration to make before you design your architecture.
Yeah, do you find that businesses kind of start out on one Shopify store and then think, actually, maybe now is the time to add more? Or do you think it is something that they kind of consider from the get-go?
I find normally they start with the one store
Yeah.
and then get their comfort zone and their experience with that store. And then when they expand, almost always it seems that they go to then a second Shopify and a third
Yeah.
Shopify store.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's really good to know. I guess in particular for these kind of videos, I do like want to talk about those in between kind of stages, right? Like not just you
Yeah,
starting
sure.
and then you're kind of ready to sell, what's happening all in between the middle, and when do you make these decisions? But that's really good. That's a great call, of course. Get yourself comfortable with that one Shopify store, and then when you are considering expanding, kind of having to think about whether opening up another storefront is kind of the right decision. Yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, how about when it comes to, so say you kind of in another country and you're expanding, you've obviously got to work out your shipping and who's going to handle all your logistics, how you're going to get your product there. What do you see as most common? Do you see that people are hiring a third party, or are they doing it themselves, hiring people on the ground over in that country? What things should people be considering there?
Look, that's probably one of the biggest things to figure out, and it can
Yeah.
be the most challenging piece as well about shipping internationally. And I guess again, there's going to be no one size fits all because it depends on the product you're selling. But the sweet spot in my view is that you're bringing product in from China, which I'd say the vast majority of our clients are in that situation, and you're able then to arrange a shipment from, say, China to, say, a third party warehouse in the source country. Now, where this gets challenging is you need to be trading in a volume that's very large to make it cost efficient. And this is where owners of e-commerce businesses get a little nervous, particularly if you're in your early stages, because when you're talking about a shipping container and you're selling pens, that is probably millions of units that you're prepared to invest in. Whereas I guess if your product's bigger, maybe there's a little less of a risk. But if you only then want to send a proportion of a shipping container, it's cost prohibitive often then to freight that into the source country. So to answer your question, Ellen, there's really no one size fits all, but do be prepared for, I guess, a couple of new variables that are in the piece. The first is that you may be used to, for example, ordering from Alibaba into Australia in shipments of less than $1,000. Often our clients do that to avoid paying GST when they clear the goods, and I'm sure it's the same in New Zealand for yourselves. And maybe that person has like a little shed in their backyard. This is quite common,
Yeah.
where they're unpacking the product into and they're just bringing in those sub $1,000 shipments into their shed. They then discover they're onto a cracker of an idea. Maybe they're selling something that's really unique and different and they have no competition, and they see an opportunity in England to do the same thing. But the variables have changed in that now there's no shed in the backyard, right? Because they
Yeah.
don't have a partner over there. And it's really cost prohibitive to just send something in that's less than $1,000, because if they engage a 3PL, which stands for a third party logistic warehouse, they're charged normally a set fee just to unpack that shipment and then store it. And that might be the same fee whether they're unpacking a whole container or a little brown paper parcel, for example. So you want to deal in a bigger way. And obviously that's a really big investment when it's your first foray into the new country. So that really tends to be the most common situation is our clients find a third party logistic warehouse. And how do they find the warehouse? Well, I don't really have any real life examples to share, but logic tells me they're using forums on places like Facebook. So
Yeah.
we have one here in Australia called Shopify Business Australia. You guys at A2X have a really great forum as well. And so ecom clients can go on to there and say, look, I'm thinking about selling in United States. Does anybody have a warehouse they've had a good experience with? And I suspect that's probably how they're doing their research these days.
Now, do you just kind of further to that, like say you aren't going to be shipping a full container, because yeah, that is big. And that's a lot of kind of product to get into a different country. Do you recommend any kind of third-party logistics that do, you know how you can get those ones where you almost take like a crate in a big container? Do you use any of those, or do they usually kind of either go for it all, or like how does that work?
Oh, I didn't really sort of cover some of the other options, but there are
Yeah,
other options in terms of you
yeah,
can still ship it here, say to Australia or to New Zealand, and then ship from Australia in brown paper parcels to England, for example.
yeah,
Now, there's two big issues with that approach that I see, and I'll pick on England for
yeah.
purposes of this example. The first is the time. And for those of you that are moving, I guess, into wave 2 or 3 of your ecom business, you're probably thinking a lot now about psychology, because this is sort of where the big e-commerce conferences are taking you, and they ask you questions like, if you need a bottle of wine, would you order that on the internet if I told you it would take 3 days to arrive? Or would you just drive to your local bottle shop and buy it? And probably most would say
Yeah.
I'd drive. And so we're getting now instant gratification scenarios, particularly along the eastern seaboard of the United States and in major cities in England, where people are expecting their package within 24 hours. That's the mentality Amazon is creating.
Uh,
So if you're shipping your product from Australia to England and it's going to take 2 weeks and plus with COVID, would that be a sustainable situation? I'll leave that for you to decide with your own business. The second is if you're shipping from Australia to England, you remember that EU VAT and UK VAT
yeah,
situation, and you're not registered for VAT, and your declared value on your package is, say, £100, that's going to cost your customer to pick that up £120 because the
right,
post office is going to see it's come from overseas. Compare that to a third party warehouse in England, next day delivery potentially because the product's already there. And they take care of those VAT type situations where they've got a number they put on the sticker that goes on the package that then tells the post office they don't then have to collect the VAT. So I'm going to suggest in most situations, 3PL will be the decision you make. And if you're using a 3PL, back to the big container versus other scenarios, you may not find it cost efficient to just ship small parcels.
yeah, cool. That's so, yeah, that's another thing for them to consider, but that's cool. And like you recommended, go on forums and have a read and see what's the best option for you. I just kind of heard some horror stories, last year with COVID and things not getting into ports or not getting on the boats. And like, obviously you're so right. People expect their deliveries tomorrow. Like I personally also look for like, okay, how long's the shipping? I mean, in New
Yeah.
Zealand, I've kind of come to terms with the fact that I have to wait a little bit longer, but hopefully one day.
Yeah,
um,
it's an amazing, Amazon has just sort of hit Australia's shores in the last couple of
yeah,
years. I presume there be similar experience for yourselves in New Zealand as well with Amazon.
well, Amazon's not really in New Zealand, right?
Oh,
Like
okay.
we can buy off Amazon, and I'm actually pretty sure they are coming to Amazon, like coming to New Zealand, whether or not I'm probably a little bit behind the times here, but I've always just kind of thought we've not really got the population for it.
Oh, well, Australia was in the same boat and they
Yeah,
landed here. But interestingly, and this may be something you guys will learn when Amazon goes into a big way, they have this tag that suppliers can have called Amazon Prime, which maybe
yeah,
you've heard of. I know at A2X, you guys
yeah,
are all over Amazon anyway. And Amazon Prime often denotes it's an FBA supplier, which stands for Freight by Amazon, i.e., that product is held in Amazon warehouses. And there's a way, as you probably know, that you can filter to just look at prime suppliers.
yeah,
I find the psychology is so interesting in that if you pick someone that's prime, you'll probably have that delivery within 24 hours. And that plays in, I think, to you don't
Yeah.
even want to look at your choices without Prime. But back
Yeah.
to the overseas and these e-coms that are
Yeah.
considering, and that's obviously another way you can go internationally that we really didn't cover in depth, but just
Yeah.
picking a vendor like Amazon, obviously huge uh, erosion to your margin because of
Yeah.
the commissions they're charging, but making the most amazing experience for the customer is playing up there in the top three, I think, considerations.
Oh, totally. Like when you need something, I remember, yeah, when I was living in the UK, and I would need I could get something that day, which was just ridiculous. And then when I moved home to New Zealand, I was like, well, back to 3-week shipping, but
Yes.
yeah, that's fine. Hey, well, I would love to get briefly into accounting and tracking, accounting for expanding into other countries and what that entails and how you handle all of that for your clients. How do you go about tracking profitability by country for your clients?
Well, that really comes down to, first of all, back to that structure conversation we had. Is the client still trading from one structure overseas, or have they chosen to put an additional structure in place? So if they're still trading from their original structure, we here at Bean Ninjas only work with Xero as our accountancy platform, and we use something called tracking categories to then focus on country-specific tagged items versus, I guess I'll call them head office. Lots of businesses
Yeah,
have expenditure that relates to every country, like their accountancy fees. And so I won't go on and on
yeah,
about that, but there is functionality that we can use to track, and obviously by partnering with yourselves at A2X, there is some really great functionality there that A2X can throw those tracking attributes into Xero for us as well, which is very helpful. If it's a decentralized structure, it makes our job from a country by country a little easier in that we've got an individual P&L coming out of individual Xero
yeah.
files.
Right. And if they are expanding, I mean, Bean Ninjas is slightly unique in the sense that you have offices in those two key countries as well as Australia, so US, UK, and Australia. Do you recommend people find an accountant or a bookkeeper in those home countries rather than relying on their accountant in the home country that they're in?
Well, look, I'll take that a little further, and I'm a little biased, so I'll say, what I think should happen is, I think first of all, consider which country you as the owner of this e-commerce
Yeah,
structure live, and that would be your closest relationship. And assuming you're not already using Bean Ninjas and you have your own accountant down the road, in that scenario, yes, you'd probably want to be reaching out for one-to-one relationships in those other countries and figuring that out. But preferably, you'd be considering moving accountants at that stage to
yeah,
pick someone like ourselves that has those structures already in place for you. And we're not the only ones that do what we do. And any big five would absolutely be, representative in every country, such that your main relationship stays with the key accountant in your country, and then they leverage on their networks to manage on your behalf with their associates.
yeah. So it's so amazing. But even just talking to you today just shows how important it is, I think, to have an accountant that understands e-commerce. So I know that, even the big five, they have offices in every single country in the world, but have they really got their head around best practice for e-commerce accounting? So I would definitely recommend checking out Bean Ninjas if you are a 7-figure e-commerce company and you are thinking about expanding or just need an accountant that understands e-commerce, to head along to beanninjas.com.au
That's
if you're
right.
an AU. Yeah.
No,
But
it's just
yeah,
.com.
it is .com. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, I just last kind of question that I think would be really good to go over before we wrap up, because there's just so much to consider. But what about accounting for those multiple currencies? I know we kind of briefly touched on how they charge in multiple currencies depending on Shopify stores, but how do you report the multiple currencies back to your clients?
Oh, that's a conversation for a
Isn't it?
whole hour as well, Ellen. But
Is
I'll
it?
give
Yeah.
A2, there's a front end and back end. So I'll give
Yeah.
A2X credit where credit's due as well. Using a connector like A2X between, say, Shopify and Amazon and Xero is really, really helpful in these multi-currency situations, because A2X will push that deposit into Xero, configured to the currency you prefer. So sometimes you'll see it reconverts all of the FX, say through Shopify, back to New Zealand dollars, and then the New Zealand comes into, it all comes back to, by the way, with A2X, what Shopify pays out in. So if
Right.
Shopify's paying out in US dollars, A2X will push a US dollar sale into Xero. If it's selling in US dollars but paying out in Australian dollars, the Australian sale comes in. So a lot of that heavy lifting is done for you by A2X. Back to just, I guess, the complexities of
Yeah.
accounting, there's a myriad of them around unrealized foreign gains and losses, making sure you're raising invoices, both sales and accounts payable, in the source currencies, using intermediary products like Air Wallets or Wise. So my advice to yourselves as an e-com owner that's maybe trying to do bookkeeping themselves, or their spidey senses are telling them that their accountants don't totally understand the complexities that you're presented with, is to really shop around, consider using a specialist in that area. And just like asking a plumber to fix a leaky tap, just trust that those service providers know what they're doing and will explain in layman's language to you to the extent that's possible to translate those complicated issues for you.
Yeah, cool. Oh my goodness, it's so interesting. And like sometimes I feel like I say this every kind of time I talk to a new expert, is that, it is actually can be quite overwhelming in those areas, right? Like in accounting or in marketing. And with e-commerce, there's so often that the business owners are doing a lot of this themselves. And that's why it was really appealing to start with. But as you do start to kind of scale up and grow, totally go and find those experts in that space to help you, whether that be a person or a tool or software. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on and speaking about how to expand internationally and just get the audience thinking about certain areas that they may not have thought of. It's not as simple as just shipping to a different country.
That's
But yeah,
for sure. Thank
you
you,
so
Ellen.
much.
Appreciate you having us.